Welcome to everyone. My name is Kay. I am from Open Contracting Partnership. And for those of you who are less familiar with Open Contracting Partnership, we are a nonprofit that works in the United States and abroad to make public contracting more efficient, open, and to deliver better results for everyone. We work with governments, civil society, and the private sector. And as we've been supporting our partners over these last few weeks on emergency procurement, we've learned just how important the role of open and efficient procurement is for helping to manage this crisis. And when we came together with Aspen, it was so clear to us that there was an urgent need for a space for a conversation with members from across the procurement ecosystem about how we are responding to COVID-19. And every day it's more apparent that the fiscal impact of COVID-19 is unprecedented. In these times, we really must make the most out of our limited public money that we have to effectively fight the virus, protect our populations, as well as, very importantly, to rebuild our economy. We are very eager to hear from our amazing selection of panelists and all of you about the challenges that you're experiencing and the practices that are helping you to get to better results, especially around open data, transparency, and collaboration. Quick overview of our agenda. The first half of our call will be a discussion with our terrific panelists, and then we're going to try to hold back at least 20 minutes for an open conversation with all of you. This is not a webinar. We really intend for this to be an open space for us to have a conversation and collaborate. We feel that there are so many great people on the call today, and we want to make sure that we hear your voices and all that you have to share and contribute. So quick ground rules. We know that there's a lot of people on the call today, so we ask that you follow our guidance to make sure that it's a welcome and safe space for everyone. We invite you to make a generous use of the chat function in the sidebar to get your comments in and questions. We also would love it if you would contribute to the document, which we've been sharing around earlier with our notes. And when the time comes to ask our panelists questions, I'll be keeping track of who's asking what. And during the open conversation, I will be making sure that I have an eye on that, and we are calling people in the order that they volunteer. We also ask that you keep your comments and questions brief, given just how many people are on our call today, so that way everyone has a chance. And lastly, as is our new reality, since we're on Zoom, please keep yourself on mute if you are not talking. Now that all that housekeeping is out of the way, I am honored to introduce you to Jennifer Bradley, the founding director of the Aspen Institute for the Center for Urban Innovation, who will set out the framework context for the call today.
Thanks so much, Kay. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm extremely grateful to all of our panelists who have made the time in this incredibly busy and urgent period that we're living in to talk about the importance of procurement. The Center for Urban Innovation works with leaders in city government, nonprofits, philanthropies, and the private sector to make sure that local innovation agendas are aligned with inclusion and equity imperatives. We were drawn to procurement as a topic because procurement is essential to both innovation and equity. And procurement is particularly in the spotlight these days and under great pressure as city governments are working very hard to get the emergency equipment that we need. We're so glad to work with OCP on this call to help folks understand what responses are working now to get essential supplies and services delivered. And we also want to understand where responses are falling short and how to close the gap, particularly on questions of equity. Often I think the approach that many people have to equity is that it's something that you can do in good times, but in case of emergency, it's all about sort of efficiency and power purchasing. But particularly given the equity implications of who's being hit hardest by COVID-19, both economically and in a health perspective, we understand that equity can't wait. Equity has to be a part of everything. So I'm particularly interested in hearing how governments are trying to make sure that they fulfill their equity commitments during this emergency time. And finally, we want to learn about what the emergency is teaching us that can guide how local governments buy services and supplies during the recovery and afterwards. Can this crisis seed lessons for local governments and the larger ecosystem of small business and procurement to be more flexible, more transparent, more collaborative, and more equitable? So I'm extremely excited for this discussion today, and we'll turn it back over to Kay.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. Now we really do have a terrific group of panelists today, so I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves and let us know what you have been doing to keep sane during these crazy times. And let's get started with you, Beto.
Hey everyone, my name is Beto Altamirano. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Iris. We build collaborative platforms to engage the public from behalf of the government to residents. What am I doing to stay sane? I bought this Peloton before this crisis, and it was the best purchase that I made so far. I'm riding that thing every day, so that's keeping me sane.
Wonderful. And Jennifer from New York City?
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for inviting the City of New York. Happy to be here to represent us. I'm from the Mayor's Office of Contract Services, and our office oversees about $20 billion worth of annual procurement. That's across 40 city agencies. We have a team of over 6,000 procurement staff across the city. We have 15,000 vendors, slightly more than that actually, who are registered to do business with the city. So the scope of our work is quite broad. And we are currently pursuing technology initiatives to digitize procurement across the city of New York, while we are also supporting the city in our COVID relief response. I, in particular, oversee policy and partnerships inside MOX, and that means that I'm working to cultivate relationships with our vendor communities. As Jennifer flagged, equity being of particular interest, we spend a lot of time working with MWBEs, as well as human service nonprofits, which we'll get to, I think, in a little bit when we start talking about our response. In terms of what keeps me sane, honestly, the work is tremendous right now. Having the perspective that we have in the city, having a structure, having so much to do every day helps to keep me motivated, keep us motivated, keep us moving. A glass of wine often helps. And I agree with Beto that Peloton, especially their new online apps, are a welcome distraction.
Great. And Jennifer, is Dan joining us today or not? Do you know?
I think it's just me
Just you
on the phone. Yeah.
Great. Mm-hmm. All right. So in that case, it is over to Skye.
Hi, everyone. Skye Kelley, founder and CEO of Avisar. We are a procurement, sourcing, vendor registration, and e-certification platform, all combined into one, like a LinkedIn for the supply chain, with a special emphasis on helping small businesses, especially minority and women-owned businesses, contract with governments at the local level and at the federal level. You can think again as that LinkedIn for the supply chain. So what's keeping me sane these days? It's hard to stay sane. It really is. Let me just put that out there. I think one of the things that's helping is that we are able to help our local governments be able to go online and digitize in a time and fashion and very quickly when they need it most. We are able to help small businesses, which, as all of you know, small businesses are really suffering right now, especially minority and women-owned businesses. They are suffering the most. And so being able to provide that voice, both at the local level and assistance, as well as now at the federal level, being able to share the experiences of our small businesses and advocate on behalf of them and make sure that we are moving into this new era is really helping. Outside of that, I don't have a Peloton. I actually hate exercise bikes. It doesn't work for me. But I have started to do online workout classes in the last couple of days. I'm going to be honest, not before then. So that's what's helping. That's helping.
Great. And Michael? We might have Michael from
Hey,
Los Angeles
sorry.
with us. Are you here?
Hey guys,
Great.
I'm here. Sorry.
Welcome.
I'm sorry, I've been a little bit crazy this morning. So am I just supposed to introduce myself?
Just
My name is
introduce
Michael
yourself.
O.
Yep. Keep
Okay.
going. And then
I'm such a Zoom newbie. I'm terrible at this, sorry. My name is Michael O. I'm the purchasing agent and general manager for the Internal Services Department for the County of Los Angeles. I have only been with the county for about a year. I am not sane right now, so I'm not doing anything to keep myself sane. And very happy to be interacting with OCP and Jennifer, who is the best facilitator I've ever seen in action. Sky, a good friend, and all of you, and Jennifer, who I love, who I hired and one day will hire me. And thank you for inviting me.
well, that's it. That's an intro. We are also very excited to have all of you with us. Really is a wonderful panel. And our next terrific panelist is Mariel.
Hi everyone, I'm Mariel Reed. I'm a former public servant and co-founder of CoProcure. We're a mission-driven startup that supports more transparent, efficient, and inclusive public procurement, especially focused at the local level. And we do that by helping local governments find and share contracts across the country. Yeah, I think sanity has become a relative thing. I agree with the wine happening oftentimes a little bit earlier in the evening. But yeah, my husband and I got a puppy back in January, which feels like years ago. And he's been a huge source of entertainment for us both, and a good excuse also to get outside for some socially distanced fresh air and exercise. He's also made some guest appearances on our Zoom team meetings on CoProcure, so he occasionally chimes in there as well.
Well, he's welcome to contribute to this meeting as well if that happens. Greg, you're the last one.
Sure. Hi, I'm Greg Wass. I'm with the Government Performance Lab at the Harvard Kennedy School. The GPL conducts research and provides technical assistance to state and local governments on how they can improve the results that they achieve for their constituents, particularly through contracting. I want to shout out to Oscar Hernandez, who's in the audience here from OCP, for inviting me to join today's panel. Thanks, Oscar. Good to see you. And let's see, to stay sane, I guess I've become a bit of a farmer. We've been growing our own sprouts and kind of a sprout starter, and we just planted some dill outside, got some good weather. It's very cool. So we do miss people, but we're communing with our plants here.
That's great. So now that we've talked about all the things that are keeping us sane, I'm afraid we're going to have to go back into the craziness that is our current reality. And I think that no one is better prepared to speak about just the challenges and the real craziness of these times than Jennifer, who's based in New York City. So Jennifer, my first question is for you. We would really love to hear about your on-the-ground perspective. I'm sure that we could talk a whole hour about this, really. But
Yeah,
give us some of your
more than that,
challenges,
for
what you've
sure.
been working on and seeing in New York City.
Yeah, for sure. I guess there's a few ways of thinking about it. There's the nuts and bolts challenges, in the weeds technical pieces, such as sourcing PPE. I mean, we're all familiar with the hourly news broadcasts around, or blogs, or however you're catching your information, around the struggles with sourcing, ventilators, testing now. So across the board, that's been challenging. We experience it even in the most sort of basic way, in just trying to get masks and gloves, just across the world, really. Folks are stretched on trying to get those resources. So you have some of that technical challenges that you're seeing every day on the ground, and trying to be creative and trying to move quickly because lives literally depend on it. And then there are some sort of bigger structural challenges that are changing and surfacing every day. One is the economic financial challenges that we're facing. There's a loss in tax revenue. There's high unemployment. How do you determine which services to maintain, which services to modify, which ones need to be cut? In the city of New York, as it's true for many of the cities across the country, human services are delivered by nonprofits, but they're essentially a branch of the government. And so how do you ensure that you maintain those services, you maintain those organizations? They're important now, and they're going to be important when we get through this period of time and moving forward. So how do you think about that given the economic climate? And the other piece that is sort of a challenge, and one that we always try to grapple with, and we're coming up with new ways of addressing it here, is communication. So how do you make sure that you're communicating with your vendors? How do you make sure that you're opening up lines of communication with suppliers? How do you communicate across city agencies? How do you communicate within City Hall? Figuring it out. There are creative ways. Folks are moving. We are repositioning internally in order to respond to the crisis. So understanding who to talk to, how to talk to them, how to get them into a virtual room. And with providers, we're doing that through a centralized team. It's the C19 HHS response team. It is a group of folks from MOX, from our Office of Management and Budget, from City Hall teams, deputy mayor teams, who have come together to look at the sector across issue areas and create guidance and information and channels for communication so that we can share immediately when we know things are shifting. We can hear immediately from them when they need support. It's hard to deliver bad news. There's a lot of bad news being delivered, but it has to be delivered, and we have to try to work together to figure out how to get through it.
Thank you. That and from, I think, on behalf of everyone on the call, we wish you the best as you confront this crisis. Michael, we'd love to also get the on-the-ground story in LA County.
Sorry, I'm still trying to figure out how this works. So I think Jennifer hit on all of the big issues that we're also facing. I actually just recently had to initiate a purchasing freeze across the county. We have a spending freeze as well. Everything that we've been doing in terms of the response to COVID has been extremely expensive. And unlike the federal government, or unlike even New York City, we don't have our budget's only about 34 billion, which seems like a lot, except it's not. The on the ground stuff is interesting. Maybe I'll go, since Jennifer hit like sort of the high level pieces, which I think are very important for people to understand. I'll go a little bit level below, which is that in LA, I think this is the urgency and the level of sort of stress and intensity is something that I don't think anyone on my team or anyone that I've spoken to across the region in terms of the sourcing and procurement of these necessary PPEs or anything else that we need in terms of the response has been like no one's ever experienced anything like this. And I know New York in particular has experienced it like 100-fold. Right, we've been lucky here. This is our second week of what was expected to be our peak, and our projected deaths are lower now than they were even 3 weeks ago. We're at a relatively decent hospital capacity for ICU beds as well as emergency room beds and overall capacity. But we did just a couple weeks ago, and if you catch me looking down at my phone, even now we're still at like that sort of urgent, critical level for certain types of PPE. There was a week where it was actually easier for me to get 4 private planes willing to go pick up respirators from China than it was for me to find legit respirators, right? You go down all of these rabbit holes that take hours, days to figure out, and you're still, and they come back with nothing. I was on the phone with 3M's global risk team yesterday describing one of the rabbit holes that I went under, and they were telling me, look, we don't have any supply. We don't have, this would probably be good for people to know, they don't sell in Europe. So if someone's telling you that they have a cache of 3M 1860s in Europe, they don't have that. They don't sell in Europe because of the regulatory stuff. If someone from like the lot conformance documents are all probably fake. You know, just, I think on the one hand, you're seeing the best in people, and then on the other hand, you're also seeing the worst in people. So that's what you're seeing on the ground. And I think it's, in some ways, it's amazing because, you know that the work that you're doing, which is always related to the public good, was making a difference, but now it's potentially really saving lives on a daily basis. So that's really great, but that's also like kind of stressful for people. And so if you can't get something, it's really tragic. And then you're feeling very desperate all the time, right? And so I know some jurisdictions have been prepaying or, doing the deposits or doing escrows as necessary. We have not done that because we've been lucky. We haven't had to do that, but also I think Dan from New York came up with this term, but this gray market sourcing, we just all have to be very careful about it. And so I'll stop there because I think that gives you a little bit of flavor of what we're dealing with.
Yeah, and it's true. It is just a flavor of what we're dealing with. And I think we're going to talk more about some of those challenges that you highlighted for us as we continue this conversation. So speaking of challenges, Beto, I know that you have a background in thinking about transparency and community and engagement, and these are both certainly crucial factors right now to respond to this crisis, but unfortunately, transparency and community engagement are also some of the first approaches that governments can drop at these times. Love to hear about what you see as some of the main challenges right now, especially in regards to these factors.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, transparency and public access during a time of crisis is important and necessary, for the clarity into like government decision-making processes. And it gives, the public better reassurance about what the government is doing, right? But it's easy to drop, like you mentioned, right? So we must find flexible ways and resilient ways to, engage our residents in a meaningful conversation beyond just the current crisis, right? Is to give them access. So the number one challenge, right, is that all the efforts that make our cities thrive, right, such as town halls, public involvement efforts that include large gatherings of crowds, today make our cities vulnerable, right, to spreading the virus. So how do we respond to that? That's the question, right? And so we are seeing how technology can help us, such as having this panel virtually, right? But at the same time, the technology industry, which I operate in, can only adapt as fast as the city is open to welcoming those type of services, right? Through procurement or through, direct allocation of budgets from a department or let's say a city councilman's office. But the idea here is that if citizens, are being asked to stay at home and, follow these ordinances, which is important so that we can fight the virus, the citizens should also demand from, their public officials more transparency in the form of getting them involved in the public policy process. And that could be by, informing the public about, these meetings are taking place on a daily basis or weekly basis, and two, providing these available technologies to maximize the real-time public engagement. But then you run into the issue of the digital divide, right? Where you have a lot of folks in communities that don't even have access to internet, right? So it's a complex environment to operate in, right? When talking about engaging the public during a time of crisis. In my case, for example, we launched a COVID-19 support tool that is a self-screening tool, a price gouging and a large gathering module reporting tool that is free for the public. Why did we do that? We were trying to find a way to go through procurement, but we found that small startups dealing with technology, trying to help cities, we're gonna have an uphill battle, right? When introducing these type of tools or environments to cities. And so we decided to go ahead and give it out for free. And the response has been great. It has also helped us, establish relationships with city governments that before we had never talked to, right? And the idea here is to also incentivize those small and medium-sized cities that maybe do not have access to, large technology platforms or suites from, Oracle, Motorola, and so on, right? So as a startup, we understand that small organizations such as small cities and medium-sized cities run into a lot of trouble, right, when trying to purchase this type of items. So our response was, let's give it out for free, right? And so the way we're deploying it, right, is through advertisement in different cities in Texas, and the use has skyrocketed. Then what happens is that we send emails to the governments about the use of the service, and now they can access the dashboard, right, the product itself. So we've seen how like different methods can be applied to this crisis when dealing, right, with procurement or being a startup trying to work with government. But the reality is that it's not easy. It's not easy, and I think we're going to see more of how startups in the technology space working with city governments will find creative ways to continue that relationship, because things have become a little bit stagnant, like you mentioned earlier today, in regards to the challenges that we're facing with simple products such as face masks and other type of products. Well, now imagine the layer of technology, which is more complex. It's more difficult to make a government welcome a technology component, without procurement or in an efficient and timely manner. And then even more, the idea of where do you find the budget when in a time of crisis, budget is of the essence. So those are some of the variables and challenges that we face and how we overcame this challenge of working with city government during a time of crisis.
Thank you. Yeah, one thing that we've also observed at OCP is just that a lot of the challenges that were already in place are just magnified right now in this crisis situation. And someone who can speak well to what's happening across the country right now is Greg. So Greg, it does seem to be the Hunger Games out there when it comes to securing some of the materials that we need, and everyone seems to be competing with everyone. So I'd love to get your take on what policy and coordination challenges you've seen, and also what strategies you've seen that can help us lead to better results.
Thanks. So yeah, similar to the Hunger Games, I'd characterize the current state of procurement and government as something between frantic and highly adaptive, sort of the twin poles, and we've kind of heard that from our speakers from the cities as well today. In our view, governments are having to buy things they've never bought before. They buy them faster than they've ever bought anything before. Sometimes they're trying to extend and repurpose existing contracts, make a decision about what's an emergency and what's not an emergency, a real emergency, and do all this while we're working from home, dealing with budget shortfalls, and still maintaining ethics and transparency, to Beto's comments. The GPL has heard a lot recently about states competing with each other and sourcing PPE, but there's actually a lot of cooperation going on that we see, mainly at a regional level. Cities and states are frequently in touch with each other and with national organizations like the NIGP, the National Institute for Governmental Procurement, and the What Works Cities partners, including Results for America, Sunlight Foundation, and ourselves, just to share tips and get ideas. Some of the things we're seeing happening right now, we expect will end once we're out of this, and other things we certainly hope will continue. So we hope there's some actually good things to pull out of this in the end. In terms of those things that we expect will end, there's been a move away from competitive bidding for essential goods and services. To Michael's point, some of the sourcing that's happening, just trying to find stuff and not really worrying about the price or the source, and trying to establish the source as a legitimate or genuine source. For example, some action to deal with this, the governor of Connecticut, Ned Lamont, recently issued an executive order allowing for a waiver of competitive bidding in emergency situations only. The competitive bid requirement is probably the single most time-consuming process in procurement. So it probably makes sense to suspend that when you have an immediate need for PPE. And their EO restricts the waiver to COVID-related purchases, and they will go back to competitive bidding once COVID is over. So on to sort of those examples of adjustments that governments are making to procurement practice that we hope will continue. One is the adjustment to work from home, both for staff and for vendors. Procurement processes have been heavily paper-based in many places and face-to-face going into the pandemic. And governments have now been forced to move to things like online vendor conferences and online proposal submission. No longer do you have to drop off 10 hard copies of your proposal into a marked box and have them, tabbed and spiral bound. That will no longer be the case. New Orleans had a requirement that their RFP evaluation committee would meet to do evaluation scoring in an open public meeting, which is great for transparency. I'd never actually seen this anywhere else, but it's not so good for social distancing. So a few weeks ago, New Orleans held their first online evaluation committee meeting in public, but online, and it went well. So they'll be doing this way for the foreseeable future. These kind of adaptations that get rid of outdated, cumbersome practices, we hope will live on, and they're good permanent improvements to the procurement process. Thing we see as repurposing of existing contracts to adapt to the current situation. Another example from New Orleans is the one-stop workforce services vendor is now helping people who are out of work to fill out applications for unemployment insurance and help them navigate the system. And in Detroit, we work with an office there that formerly did lower income home renovation projects. They completely shifted their efforts to help people apply for programs to be able to stay in their homes. So we're seeing this kind of flexibility and adaptability happening in many of the places we work. And it tells me that in the future that state and local governments will want to think more broadly about the needs of the people they serve and work with vendors and providers to figure out how to meet those needs with more flexible and adaptable contracts. Our work at the Government Performance Lab generally tries to get governments to determine what results they want to achieve with contracts and then design performance measures and incentives to drive towards those results. So we want to help governments move away from just funding activities and toward funding outcomes. And it turns out that what they're doing in response to the crisis is actually moving them in this direction. They're learning more about the marketplace, some things that we never thought we'd have to learn, but certainly moving in that direction. They're collaborating more with their service providers to adapt contracts to new reality. And they're ready, I think, to take the next step of developing contracts that reward innovation and results. And we're happy to help them with that step.
Great, thank you, Greg. Also thinking about solutions, I'd love to hear from you, Mariel, about the work that you do with collaborative purchasing and what other approaches you've seen work well in this time.
Yeah, thanks. So CoProcure helps local governments generally save time and taxpayer dollars by sharing contracts. And we serve a few hundred governments across the United States. So when we started getting requests for help from local governments looking for PPE, we started with what we knew, which is cooperative contracts. So as Greg mentioned, like during non-emergency situations, governments typically have to buy off of contract created through a formal competitive bidding process. And as an alternative to running a new competitive bidding process, which typically takes like 4 to 24 months, governments can buy from suppliers that are already on contracts that other governments have created. So by using a shareable or cooperative contract, government buyers can save time and oftentimes also achieve cost savings through aggregated purchasing power. So our core product is a free tool that helps governments find and buy from those suppliers available on cooperative contract. And we responded initially to the PPE crisis by putting a list of suppliers together that were available to sell those items that we were seeing governments needed to purchase through existing contracts. The interesting thing was that we realized that the problem that we were solving for was no longer compliance. So because it's an emergency situation, the requirement to buy off of competitively bid contracts has been waived for most agencies. What we realized is that we were actually solving for this problem of trust, as some of the other panelists have mentioned, especially in this moment, which has been described as the Wild West of purchasing. We are seeing extremely elevated levels of price gouging, competition, counterfeit products, and fraud. It's a very chaotic situation. And so it's not surprising that governments want to purchase from suppliers that other governments have already purchased from because they trust these suppliers more. They've been through a diligence process, they've sold to other government customers, they have more of a reputation because they've been established for a long amount of time. So our initial response again at CoProcure was to help governments share those suppliers that were already available on contract. But we also very quickly experienced like this need is so great, and many of those existing suppliers quickly ran out of available inventory. Many of them are starting to come back online, but there was a period of a few weeks at least where the known suppliers that were available and trusted had nothing or were unsure about when they would have inventory again. And so we really felt a need to support the local governments that we serve by starting to source and diligence new suppliers. And so we very quickly learned, of course, that actually sourcing new suppliers isn't hard. Sourcing real and not fraudulent suppliers, in other words, doing the diligence on the suppliers is the really hard part. That's because there's limited time to conduct a potentially really complicated process that in, again, normal times would require boots on the ground, seeing, the manufacturers and the factories. And so on the one hand, you have a really urgent need, you have to move quickly if you want to get access to available inventory. But on the other hand, like you're being asked to purchase something that is inherently extremely risky. So actually collaboration we found becomes really important here too. And what I mean by that is not collaborating to work together to create contracts, but collaborating together to build trust and do that diligence process faster. So we've seen that local governments have been sharing the suppliers that they're working with so that other governments can fast track their diligence and vetting process. And what the role that we've played during this time on CoProcure is essentially helping to collect and record those purchasing experiences, and then elevate new suppliers that have successfully served local governments before and have a verified buyer reference to a list essentially of more vetted and trusted suppliers. I think it's clear that we need more collaboration. We need to be buying together, not just at the local government level, but at the federal level to compete on this global market for masks and other items. And unfortunately, in the absence of a coordinated federal response, we've seen some collaboration activity, like states, California, for instance, stepping up to purchase materials and even sending some of those materials to other states. And we have seen some regional organizations, like one of our partners in the Kansas City metro area, the Mid-America Regional Council, leading regional efforts to source PPE and aggregating these potentially smaller orders that wouldn't otherwise be able to get access to legit PPE supply together. So collaboration is happening in purchasing, but not enough. And once again, at the local government level, I think we've seen coordination, collaboration involving working together on diligence and helping peer agencies navigate the Wild West of PPE purchasing. And I think overall, we've been really encouraged by how many local agencies have provided feedback about suppliers to enable governments, other governments, to purchase faster and with a higher level of trust during this time of need.
Great. Thank you, Mariel. Sky, so you started in your introduction to talk to us about some of the challenges that our small and medium businesses have had. And we'd love to hear more about what these SMEs can do and what local governments can do to help make it through this crisis, since they have been so hard hit and will be so important as part of our recovery efforts.
Yes, thank you. Definitely very important to help small businesses now more than ever. So first and foremost, I want to say that I really sympathize with our government agency procurement professionals right now. I know it is not easy. The things that Michael and Jennifer have shared, we've been talking to lots of procurement executives all across the country, both on the private and public sector, and it is a hard time, especially when you're in the immediate crisis situation, right? And Michael and I have talked about this several times before, but I want to take a step back for a second, because yes, technology can help. I think what we need is a shift in mentality, the mentality of government procurement. And Beto mentioned this as well. Government procurement has always been, historically, a very offline, very in-person process that's really designed more for large companies. It is, no one ever accused SAP or Oracle of being a user-friendly system, but those are the systems that are most often used. And right now we need innovation. We need a new way of thinking. We need to come together, as Mariel was mentioning, to be able to do this in a centralized effort. And that's not how the system is set up right now. You know, I'm really hoping that now that we're hopefully starting to move out of that immediate panic situation into how do we think about making changes for the long term to help benefit things, we can really assess the fact that we need more centralized systems across the board, and we need to make things easier. I know that the tendency is to go after people, to go after suppliers who you have worked with for a long time before. But we've talked about this on this call. You can't always use the same people over and over again. And by the way, most of those suppliers are not minority and women-owned businesses because it is traditionally very hard for them. The people who are getting hit hardest in this COVID crisis are minorities, both from a health perspective and from a financial perspective. Yet there's a ton of innovation that's happening in this space. And we know several small businesses, even in the LA area, who have said, we want to help. We can repurpose our systems to be able to make things that people need right now, to be able to make PPE and supply those, but where do we go? Who do we go to? So on the one hand, while the traditional mentality is, let's make this easier. So let's create another website for people to go to that is just COVID-19 related and focused, so we can bypass some of these long, lengthy processes. It actually can exacerbate the problem, because if you have every agency then already having their traditional websites and paths, and then on top of that, now we have these new COVID-19 different websites and paths, and there's no coordination among them, it's mass confusion and mass chaos. And the impetus is on moving quickly, because small businesses are dying out by the hundreds and thousands right now. We've been beating this drum for the past 3.5 years. But it has never been more evident than it is right now that small businesses are the backbone of this economy. They make up half of all employment. And we're seeing this right now. I know we're talking about local governments, but I have to share this stat with you because it was just so mind-boggling for me that the SBA received over 44 million loan applications from small businesses. There are 30.2 million small businesses in the United States. Okay, so when I talked to them, I said, well, how do we have this? Well, what's the issue? And they said, well, number one, the biggest issue is that there isn't, when you apply for a loan through the SBA, you don't receive an email saying that your application was received. So first and foremost, people don't even know if their applications were received. So now they're just reapplying in multiple places, right? But secondly, no one knows, there's no communication, there's no transparency, as Beto was mentioning, and no status updates or anything. So you don't know if where you are in the queue, if they're going to get to you, money is running out, etc. So millions of small businesses will not make it. And though it is really hard and people are pulling back on their procurement budgets, we have to find a way to work with more small and minority and women-owned businesses, because this is the crux of the economy. And I think the best way to do that is to centralize efforts and make the process easier for everyone, period. And that's really what we've done, and what we focused on at Avasar is just a centralized procurement and sourcing process where you have that linked in for the supply chain. So you have that centralized, aggregated, one place to find and vet suppliers, and then have your procurement, your RFP process. And in the RFP process, I hope we are done with the days of 375-page RFPs, right? Can I just put it out there right now? Like, that needs to end. Because we've seen that we can get things done so much faster, so much more efficient if we don't have that. And the vetting, we've heard people say, well, if we don't have those long RFPs, we can't get through the vetting process. These are two different things. These are two different things. One thing is, what is the need? Let's focus on the need and have needs-based procurements and agile procurement methodology. And the other component is vetting. So while there are some things that small businesses can do to better familiarize themselves with different processes, I really think the biggest thing that will help is to be able to centralize government systems, to have it coordinated, to make it user-friendly, and just to make it easier so that we can get through procurement, and it doesn't take 6 months to a year for every procurement process.
Well, that's a strong message to end on. Before we go to our open conversation, I have one final question for our panelists. And that's if you could answer in one sentence, as we emerge from these really challenging times, what are the lessons that you hope that the people on this call will take away from our current experience to improve our recovery efforts as we move ahead? And we can start with Beto.
Governments tend to be reactive, not proactive, but these times have really changed the way that governments are adapting to different trends. And with that, I think comes this responsibility, right, from the private sector or small businesses or startups to support governments in this trial, and error period. And the way that looks like is by, launching initiatives or pilots that can support governments in addressing and fighting these type of viruses like the COVID. Because I think, as we see on the news and we read more of this crisis may become prolonged and we may have waves of this virus, right? So the question is, as government will continue to adapt, what is the private sector, what are small businesses and startups gonna do to support these governments in the next wave or situations where we're gonna find challenges in regards to health?
Great, thank you. And Jennifer.
I guess if I'm limited to one sentence.
It's an aspiration.
I think Michael O. May agree. I think digital procurement is just more critical than ever. I mean, it touches upon what everybody said. If you have a centralized, I think Sky was talking about centralized, I was taking notes as folks were talking. Sky's talking about centralized, Greg's talking about eliminating paper and duplicative practices. Beto's talking about transparency. Mariel's talking about sourcing. If you have a digital end-to-end system that is managing the whole process, that is providing transparency for all, that's collecting data and information, how critical is data and information to responding to this crisis? Knowing who's on the front lines, knowing who their clients are, knowing how many people are being served, knowing where to get your PPE. I mean, all of that is data that could be stored in a central system and utilized in emergencies like this. So I think the one takeaway is cities need to really get moving on digital procurement. And as I mentioned before, Michael and Dan Simon at Mox were really leaders in this space. Certainly for the city of New York, which is one of the largest, if not, I think we are the largest in the country, in really moving to a digital platform to touch all of these goals that are all critical in an emergency situation and also in an everyday situation.
Great, thank you. And Sky, what are your thoughts?
While it is critical to go digital and have digital systems, I don't think it's enough. I think it has to be digital, user-friendly systems that make it easier for both participants to use. I mean, the amount of times that I've personally educated government procurement staff on their own government procurement processes to be able to accomplish their goals is astounding. So yes, digitization, user-friendly, and centralization is extremely important, and everyone needs to be focused on how do we do that to prevent this from happening again.
Thank you. And Michael.
Yeah, so I would just echo what everyone else said. The one thing that I would add is I think in a situation like this shows you what we are capable of if we have to act quickly. That I think we have to be critical about just because we can act quickly doesn't mean that we should get rid of all of the controls that we have in place or the vetting that we have in place that we need to do. But as you scale up and go digital, you should also think about just what processes don't need to exist, right? Because you have that level of transparency and that level of process. And, I think transparency, visibility, all of that is good, but it doesn't work if you don't have the talent and the people who are able and willing to to actually implement and make it work. And I think that's a far bigger challenge for all of us that we have to invest in.
Thank you. Mariel?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do have and have always had really big common challenges, and we tend to handle them at the local government level in a fairly fragmented way. And so we really do need to build procurement collaboration muscles for faster and more effective and inclusive recovery. And I think a lot of that goes back to, you know, open, free, available data for governments to be able to share, onboard suppliers, including small businesses, minority-owned and women-owned businesses, and essentially like not repeat and reinvent the wheel every single time, but to elevate up and bubble up the things that are working and the good work that is being done. Because it's legally possible to share it, and the technology exists, it just has not been applied in this domain as much as it could be. So I think this collaboration infrastructure, and it's something we're working to build at CoProcure, will be even more essential during the recovery than ever before.
Thank you. And Greg, you have the final word.
Thanks, Kay. So I think this is something that Jennifer touched on, but we recognize more than ever, I think, through this experience that we co-create government services with private and nonprofit sectors. And so we go back to our lessons learned, generally understand the marketplace and engage with providers, collaborate with service providers in an equitable way in shaping what you're purchasing, and develop contracts that reward innovation and results.
Great, thank you. So we'd hoped to reserve some time for all of you here on the call to contribute your thoughts and your ideas and your questions. I am glad to see that many of you have already been having a lively chat, but now is your moment to add your voices as well. So if you would like to say something, please leave a message in the chat. Oh, Ruairi, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question directly to folks?
Hi, my name is Ruairi Macdonald. I work with the University of Oxford's Government Outcomes Lab. We are thinking about how social services are changing and how the social services and outcomes around social services need to change and adjust and flex. But I have a question that is more directly related to what I heard just now. And the question relates, is, are you capturing and sharing information about performance and quality? It strikes me as relatively easy to share information about entity name, contract award, or prices paid. But you've all talked about the importance of trust. How do you digitize trust?
Yeah, I can start with that. So with our platform, with Avisar, we have a shared collaborative infrastructure that allows everyone meeting multiple government agencies and jurisdictions to share access to one network of vendors, which is a centralized, ever-growing network. And each agency can include their own notes about that vendor and their experiences with that vendor, and which we wanted to share across agencies. The difference is, the issue is that legally, a lot of government agencies are not allowed to share that information with each other, and sometimes not even within other departments within the same organization. So that has been a challenge. It continues to be a challenge. It is something that we are actively working on, but that's one of the big reasons why it hasn't just existed everywhere right now, because legally you can't do that.
And that is such a great question. If anyone from the panel or others on the call would like to contribute, feel free to unmute yourselves and let us know your thoughts.
Yeah, I would just say this is a huge thing that's missing in procurement in general, is like we spend so much time and effort getting through the contracting process. And I'm sure Greg can share a ton more, but it's like, and then what happened? We had a contract that existed, we had a supplier that did some work, but what were the results? What were the outcomes? That part is so often, unfortunately, missing from the contract management, process and cycle. And it, to my knowledge and in my experience, it isn't collected in a very standardized process or shared publicly. And as Skye mentioned, there are some challenges around how do you design that work and how do you share it from a legal perspective. It's been fascinating. I think by necessity, co-procure has found ourselves like asking for feedback, basically just in a more binary way around like, is the supplier real? And did the stuff that you ordered arrive like on time? Did it meet your quality expectations, et cetera? So it's a very simple rubric for now. And it's simpler obviously too when you're talking about like commodities where it's like, did it show up? Was the product legit? It's much harder and more complicated. And again, I'm sure Greg has a lot of experience here, but to evaluate services, in part because the way we ask or have asked for things occasionally in government as well doesn't always set up the relationship for success. So it's tricky and it's really needed. And I hope, we have, as we think about things that we're taking into this kind of new normal that we're establishing, that's one of the things I think I'm excited about, where we are getting more feedback from buyers and seeing governments sharing that experience more and more. Again, just on commodities for now, but we'll see how that changes and grows.
I'm sorry, I just want to weigh in on services. And Ruairi and Mariel, I'd say this applies to social services, but equally to technology services and capital projects, those kind of things. We go so far as to say that in your RFP, and this helps with the legality of it, you should indicate that if you're a successful and win the contract vendor, that we're going to do regular performance checks, and that information could be used in making future procurement decisions within that municipality or that state. But we haven't gone so far as to say that that data, which is going to be kind of unique to that city or state, could be shared with others. And I think that the consistency of it, there's a lot of issues with, whether that's subjective data or subjective data. And, but we put it up front in the RFP so that at least we feel generally there's a legal basis for collecting it and using it.
Thanks. And if folks on government, Jennifer?
Yeah, I was just going to say in the city of New York, performance evaluations are part of the standard practice. Contract management, there's certainly room for improvement, but as a basic activity, it's required for all of our human service contracts. And then, for goods, you have other ways of evaluating, et cetera. But for our services, performance evaluations are part of the regular practice. They're also actually digitized through our Passport platform. They're actually managed in Passport. They're available for other agencies to look at when they're making determinations around a vendor's responsibility, level of responsibility for an award and a contract. So we have it centralized, and there's also opportunities in our legislation and regulations for general access to performance evaluation. So on a very sort of basic level, we have it and we're using it, and thinking about how we can make them stronger as well.
Hi, my name is Judith, and I'm actually calling from Bermuda, but I'm on the board of something called Vision Spring. And some of you may be familiar with it. It's won a lot of awards. They normally provide eyeglasses to basically to the developing world, to the masses. For the first time ever, we're looking at repurposing our contacts and producing eyewear to making goggles, face masks, protective shields, et cetera, and focusing on the US market for the first time. So one of the reasons, I'm an Aspen Crown Fellow, one of the reasons I was very interested in this call was to figure out, we don't really have a system for offering what we normally offer to places like India or Ghana for the US, particularly urban US, where we see all these obvious problems. So one of the things I wanted to ask is, how would an organization like Vision Spring that does $6 million worth of work a year, how might it access or find out where is the greatest need for things like the PPE that we can access from our various sources, so it gets to the most underserved places at affordable prices. So we have product, we want to get it to the right places and find an efficient way of doing that, helping the neediest first at an affordable price. Any ideas of how to efficiently do that quickly? Thank you.
The City of New York has a centralized sourcing webpage. So I can send that along here, the link to that, but Mox has worked with the city to set up a space for folks and businesses like yourself to be able to submit information about goods and services that are available for the COVID relief. So I can send that to everybody on the chat box.
Jennifer, does that
Great.
site
And
the county and the transit authority and the other surrounding agencies?
I'm sorry, what's your question?
Does that site that you're mentioning, does that encompass the county and the transit authority and the other agencies within the greater area?
It's for the city of New York. And if you're familiar with the city of New York, we have like our mayoral agencies, and then we have the agencies that are like hybrids, like NYCHA's like that, DOE is like that. I'm not sure, my instinct is that it's covering all of those agencies as well. But don't quote me on that. But certainly you're gonna be covering at least the 40 mayorals. And it's going into a centralized hub that is then, taking the next steps with those leads and where the need is the greatest, and figuring out how to move product and services along. So my general response would be, go, if you're interested in making yourself known, just submit, and then, take it from there and see where that goes.
Great. And those of you who have other thoughts, feel free to follow up directly with Judith. She's put her contact information there. I know that Dustin had a question.
Sure.
And I think unfortunately we were like running out of time. And I think this is a good one for us to end on.
Yeah, and the topic may lead to another panel or some such. So I'm Dustin Lanier. I'm a former procurement officer, and we work with procurement shops around the country. We're currently doing new normal design exercises with several public entities, including a major city. And the concept on that is that we're not going back to where we were, because there's no back, right? The response is going to continue. And so there's things about the procurement organization that we've put on hold while we're dealing with this that is going to still need to be re-input. So I'm curious, from the entities that are doing the government side, like the New York and the LA, like, how are you both dealing with the current and then planning to bring everything else that you've been doing that you've been having to put on hold so that doesn't become the next crisis? Has that been part of your thought process, and how are you trying to address that?
Michael, you want to go first, or?
Sure. So the county, we have some level of technical functionality to provide for online sourcing, online contract management, online digital signatures. It's not, frankly, it's not coherent, and it's not built in a way that allows for easy reporting, and it's not in a place where I want it. And so that was part of my goal. I've only been here for about a year, and so part of this past year was socializing everyone and also developing a strategic plan for our next 3 years, which included a transformation, a digital transformation, as well as a process one. That obviously takes resources, and it's unclear right now whether or not I'm going to have the resources to be able to do that. So we might just have to use some belts and suspenders approach in the near term while we figure out what our path going forward is going to be. That's really the sort of high level answer. I do want to stress, though, when you talk about procurement, and we've touched on this a little bit, is I think focus a lot on the sourcing, right? On the competitive elements or finding the vendor and going through an RFP process. I think GPL does a really great job of focusing on the other important elements like contract management, which I think frankly will be a lot harder to do in the new normal if we're not going to be able to go send people, or people don't feel comfortable going out into the field, if we have to socially distance, if we, there's a lot of stuff that I think that as we think through what the next 18 to 24 months is going to be like, it's very closely connected to how we as a country and the world are going to respond to this global pandemic, right? It's not something that we're not guaranteed a vaccine. So how are we going to actually try to keep things at this at least workable level? And it's going to have workforce implications, that will sort of flow down to where we are today, right? And so I think that's going to be really challenging for us.
Thanks. And Jennifer?
Yeah, so how do we maintain I think your question is, how do you maintain the regular work while you're responding to a crisis situation? We at Mox, we have the resources. We began building a digital system a couple of years ago, so we have the resources in place. We have quite a big team now in place, and so we're able to reposition ourselves internally to new sorts of teams that work on responding every day, every hour to the twists and turns of COVID-19, while still ensuring that we have folks around and available to keep building out digital procurement. We're going live with a third major release of our platform in the next couple of months, and that will bring all signatures online. It will remove notaries. As Michael had mentioned, it's just so much more than just the sourcing. It's going to take the whole process from end to end online. So we continue to build. We're creating new ways of testing. We used to bring vendors and agencies into Mox to actually get into the system and try to break it. We can't do that now. It's much more complicated to just share screens when you're in a testing environment. So thinking of new ways to do that. But yeah, moving forward, because as we can see now more than ever, transformation to our procurement practice is essential. So we have to keep our eyes on that road.
Thank you so much. And I can't imagine better words for us to end on. So with that, over to Jennifer for closing comments.
Yeah, first of all, I'm just delighted how many folks have remained on the call, particularly Michael and Jennifer. Thank you so much for taking this time to share your resources. And also Michael, particularly giving us insight about the stresses that you're under. Just want to honor what all of you are going through, and all of you who are on the call who are doing this frontline day-to-day procurement. This, people laugh about, oh, procurement, God, that's so boring. It's essential, it's life-saving, right? This is a big part of what government does. And so it's really kind of an honor to be able to spotlight and support that work, particularly now. A couple things that I think really struck me on the call is this notion of solving for trust. As we go forward, what are the new ways that we're going to use to solve for trust? If you look at the development of procurement systems previously, the way we solved for trust was a lot of rules and a lot of lawyers. I'm trained as a lawyer, I can say stuff like that. Are there new, faster, more flexible, more accessible, more inclusive ways to solve for trust? How do we solve that problem using new technology tools? And this also, this notion of a shift in mentality. If we can create faster and more flexible processes, imperfect ones, but faster and more flexible processes for equipment that's literally life and death, presumably there is a little bit more flexibility and experimentation in the system for some of the run-of-the-mill supplies and services that governments do. So I think this can open up the thinking and perhaps give city and state and county leaders, right? The county executives, the mayors, really a powerful impetus to make procurement change and accessibility more visible and perhaps a priority for their administration. And we have all of these entities who have been on the call, who are part of OCP, who are in the Aspen network, who can help. So I really look forward to thinking about what we can do together through this crisis. And then as we start to rebuild what a procurement system might look like, again, that can be fast, effective, efficient, and equitable, so that the people who are supplying our cities are as diverse and wonderful and amazing as the people who are living in and leading our cities. So thanks so much for your time and thoughts for today.